Hi there. In the past 24 hours, George R. R. Martin put out two big interviews. Well, one is a 2-hour podcast interview with Game of Owns, and the other, not interview, it's a long blog post update about The Winds of Winter, and his thoughts on the show diverging from the books in general. The podcast, I listened through the whole thing so you don't have to. He discusses the Winds of Winter stuff a little because he recorded it right before he made the blog post. He said, I'm going to talk about this more in my blog post. Now, I'm recording this second. I just finished talking about all the Winds of Winter info from both interviews, and that's about 45 minutes long. I don't have time to re-record it. I'm annoyed because the audio is bad and it switched to my internal microphone. Bear with me on that. I don't have time to make a new one because this is breaking news. But the bulk of what there was to talk about was the Winds of Winter stuff. So that's the 45-minute version. This is the shorter, teaser lead up to that. But I say in the other thing, I'm splitting off any other useful information from these into a separate video. And I realize it makes more sense to post the short one first. The blog was all about Winds of Winter, so what was the podcast about? The not Winds of Winter parts near the end. I will say, if you have never listened to a George R. R. Martin audio interview of any kind, this is probably one of the best interviews he's done in 10 years. That, I say, in only 2 hours. Yeah, on a scale of 5 to 10 years, it's aspects of all these other interviews, but a summary of them, condensed into one 2-hour thing that gives a pretty good overview on his really expansive career. I urge all of you to find the time to listen to it. Just listen to it, when you're going to the beach or something, because it's summer now. Check it out. So, the first 50 minutes, he's talking about his career and stuff, and, I know of his early career because I've listened to other podcasts he's done. But if you haven't, it's worth a listen. Please don't just skip through it. Now, the thing is, Game of Owns, the podcast, did put out a call for questions, and said they had their own list of questions. Now, I submitted some, other people submitted some over Twitter. At the end, they go, oh man, we didn't even get to our list of questions. But in a good way, that they weren't pestering him with, plot questions, but he was talking in broad strokes about how did House of the Dragon go from how did Fire and Blood the book get written, and then how did that turn into House of the Dragon, how he met Ryan Condal, which is stuff you'd want to start with asking anyway, it took a full hour to talk about. And I mean that good. I don't feel shorted. It was actually really informative. That's probably more important in the grand scheme of things than, wow, what color was that specific dragon? This is the important stuff, and it just took that long. And as it turns out, now this is the one thing I felt was worth making a video about, but short to keep it focused in your attention, was when I made a list of, and I posted this in the Twitter thing, my channel had a list of top 10 questions that I made my own videos about. And they weren't just off the top of my head. I mean, I polled the audience with community discussions for a couple of weeks of what are your top questions? And I made up a list of the top 10 ones. And they were kind of in order, that the number one question we had, and I said, this is the one that comes up the most. If we could only ask one thing, this is the top question. How will you be handling the unreliable narrator from Fire and Blood? That there are points when the sources diverge, that there's a pro-Rhaenyra historian, a pro-Aegon II historian, and the court fool Mushroom who just says salacious nonsense. But sometimes what he says might be plausible, because you never know. So, a case in point, how did Kristen Cole and Rhaenyra break up? Did she break up with him? Did he break up with her? And it says, we don't know, because it happened in private, because this is an in-universe history book. So the big top question everyone had was, how are you handling the unreliable narrator? So while they didn't get to their checklist of questions as such, it just came up in conversation, and he spent a good 20 to 30 minutes talking about that. From 50 minutes onward into this podcast, he's talking about how Fire and Blood, the whole idea, it's diverging sources, and then eventually worked into, well, how is House of the Dragon going to address that? So, On the one hand, they didn't get to the checklist of all the obscure things, but the top question we had, he spent about 20 to 30 minutes talking about. So I feel satisfied by this. That was our biggest question, and that's what this video is on. And he said that this was really interesting. Now, Ryan Condal had already mentioned, and I talked about this in a video last week, that they will not be using 3 divergent sources, that they had to pick one version and go with it. And in some cases, it's something that they made up between the 2 versions. But Martin elaborated on that here. That in some cases, they will use... there's a pro-Rhaenyra historian, Munkin, and the pro-Aegon II historian is Eustace. And sometimes they'll go with Munkin's version, sometimes with Eustace's version. Many times they will do something in the middle. And it's not one of the 3 versions given in the book, but this is backed up by rumors we've heard, that the way Rhaenyra and Criston break up, that I've heard from rumors, isn't exactly like any one of the 3 book versions, but it's something that feels plausible, that it feels like, because the whole conceit is that this was an in-universe historian who heard 3 rival stories, and the truth, you get the feeling that anyway, that the truth was somewhere in between. So they're doing it like that working backwards, yeah, you can see how from what this is what really happened, it got slightly distorted by Munkin and slightly distorted the other direction by Eustace for all the different things. And you can parse out that it feels like this is what could have happened as a book reader in Fire and Blood, because we don't know what really happened. So yeah, that it's not quite what was on the page, but what was on the page was framed as this might not be true, or it might be distorted, so it made sense. But they'd already talked about this, he just reiterated this more clearly, and that he generally, he discussed each of these with Condal, which is good. He doesn't always 100% agree, and I know, yeah, that's what they said about Benioff and Weiss, and they went really off book. But he could have had nothing to do with this, like the Long Night prequel. Instead, he said, I've been discussing it with them a lot. And, one of the big things we discussed is, okay, this is how we're going to take that unreliable narrator moment, where it's not quite like either Munkin or Eustace's, but we're imagining that this is what really happened, that they heard secondhand and got distorted. And Martin generally gave his okay on it. We'll have to judge them on a case-by-case basis. But okay, I'm fine with that. But the reason I made this video, and I'm just dashing it off, what really interested me is that Martin said, and this is the whole point of the video, what he originally wanted to do, or half wanted to do, suggested, but backed down when they said that won't work, is he originally did suggest maybe we could show all 3 versions. Like Rashomon, he cites like Rashomon, like the Akira Kurosawa movie, like have the actors film 3 alternate scenes. And the hosts pointed out that's like the Rashomon thing that The Last Duel recently did, the Ridley Scott film, that you would see them do it 3 times, 3 different ways. Like Millie Alcock in one version would be breaking up with Criston, in the next version would be him breaking up with her. And they said, George, that would be really confusing emotionally for the actors, much less the audience would be confused. We can't really do that. It's just needlessly complicated. What other show does that? And he backed down relatively quickly. He didn't fight for that too much. And you wonder, how could that even be done? There was actually a pretty straightforward way of introducing it. Separate question related to this, Archmaester Gildane, the in-universe author of the history book Fire and Blood, who is an author insert for George R.R. Martin himself, that they asked, is Gildane going to be in this? He said, unfortunately, no, because the whole thing is Gildane is a historian writing a century and a half later. After everyone is dead, a century and a half, 200 years later, Gildane is writing about the history of the Dance of the Dragons. So he wouldn't be in this. They're not going to do that. But he said the thing he had suggested originally, and I don't know how much his heart was set on this, it was just an idea he was toying with, was to use Gildane as a framing device. And you would have points where the camera cuts to Gildane, or maybe just his voiceover, and it would be him explaining, here our sources diverge. And Munkin says, this is what happened. Then you'd see the scene on camera. Then it would go back to Gildane, who'd go, but Eustace says, this is what happened. And then you'd see the actors doing, so it would be Gildane as a framing device introducing these three alternate versions of certain key scenes. And they said, that's needlessly complicated, we can't do that. And his inspiration was actually, he said, I, Claudius. Now, if you're new to this has come up many times in other podcasts. The British miniseries I, Claudius was a major influence on Martin. If they ever do a Targaryen conquest show, I mean, the conquest through the Faith Militant Uprising through Maegor, it's basically I, Claudius with dragons. That Visenya is Livia. That Martin's always said how influenced he was by I, Claudius, how like Stannis is kind of like Tiberius, and he's this guy who didn't even want the job. Very influential on him. And he said, I already knew he was a huge fan of this, he pointed out that the framing device of I, Claudius is that every episode starts with him as an older man writing his memoirs, and explaining as the framing device at the beginning of every episode, this is what was happening, make some snarky asides about it, and then the camera cuts to like 20 to 30 years ago, younger him doing stuff. So, inspired by how I, Claudius, used the framing device of the older character writing his memoirs, he said, hey, can we have like Gildane in the style of I, Claudius, narrating as a framing device and then introducing that there's these alternate versions that we're not really sure what happened. And they abandoned that. I don't know if that was ever in serious discussion. He suggested it. I don't know if he fought for it. But it's interesting. It's just the discussions of, yeah, that would be kind of interesting for like a movie, but not for a long-running TV show. I don't think you could do that. But that's in there. He talks about this for 20 to 30 minutes. So please go and check that out. It was our biggest question, and he does address it, of why were they doing that. So the TV version, sometimes it'll be closer to what Munkin did or closer to what Eustace did. Very often it's what might have been, what Condell is imagining as the real story that secondhand through the telephone game that Munkin heard secondhand, so it's a little distorted. But you as a book reader who read all three versions, you'll be able to recognize this is probably what inspired the secondhand accounts that filtered down to Munkin and Eustace. That it's somewhere in between, and just that he discussed it with Martin each time. How much did Martin agree with each choice? That might vary from one point to the next, because they're all different like that. There's a question of, did Martin himself ever consciously think one was the real version in different cases? And at times in the book, Gildane will even say, I think Eustace might be lying here. I think Munkin is probably more accurate in this one case. But maybe Martin himself doesn't know for some of these things. He said, the fun part about writing that way, that Munkin says this is what probably happened. But then the really exciting, fun version is what, outlandish version is what Mushroom said. That when Martin as a writer is debating, it'll be fun to do this, but that's too crazy. I guess I'll have to go with the more realistic one. He said, this way, he could include both. He could include both the exciting but not realistic version and the realistic version and get away with it. So that's really the only information. The other stuff was reiterating, and it's worth listening to if you haven't seen any other podcasts, talking about how he came together with Ryan Condell, how everything developed. He didn't go into too much detail about how, Cogman was working on this early on. He got dropped, and they started over again from scratch with him. He didn't want to. He was careful not to wade into arguments. He barely discussed Benioff and Weiss, only on the vaguest of terms. That really should have been 10 seasons. But he was directing the course of the conversation to House of the Dragon and didn't want to fight anyone. He just wanted to talk about the good stuff, which, fine, fair enough. He's a gentleman about that. Listen to the whole thing. The only really meaty stuff we got of substance was this very nice, 30-minute answer on the writing of Fire and Blood and the Unreliable Narrator. So this is the short chunk of this, which is like 15 minutes long now, it's like an hour-long response to these two huge interviews. And this was the simple one. Now head over to the 45-minute one, the combined report on his blog post, plus a few asides he said about it in the podcast near the end, of his thoughts on The Winds of Winter and how the TV show diverged from his books, and how, no, they're really not going to be similar by the end. We've seen a shift of him saying they're kind of similar to, like, in the blog post, he's really starting to, more so than we've seen in years, really start saying they're more different than they are similar. But you'll see that in the next part, so head on over there.